I'm Laura Lucas Magnuson, and this is The World Unpacked.
U.S. officials have warned that Russian interference remains an active threat for the 2020 presidential election. Since its attempts to influence the 2016 race, social media sites like Facebook, Google, and Twitter have put up safeguards to prevent that from happening again.
But a new report from a professor at the University of Wisconsin shows Moscow's disinformation tactics haven't stopped. Instead, they're evolving and becoming even harder to detect.
The Internet Research Agency was a troll farm, a sock puppet army of fake online accounts and automated bots spreading synchronized talking points. Today, Facebook and the independent cybersecurity firm Graphica say members of that agency created a new site, Peace Data, which bills itself as a global news organization.
But what they were doing was, rather than using these fake personas to write stories themselves, they used them to then contact freelance journalists from around the world, including in the United States, and say, would you like to write for us? Can you send us stories?
Today on the show, we're taking a deep dive into the world of influence operations. First, we'll talk to Laura Walters, a journalist who was recently targeted by Peace Data, a covert disinformation program linked to Russia. Thanks for joining us, Laura.
Thanks for having me.
Laura, tell me a little bit about your background as a journalist. What kind of reporting have you typically done?
So I'm from New Zealand, where I've been working as a journalist for the past decade and recently moved to London. And most of my focus over the past few years has been political reporting. I was based in the New Zealand's Parliamentary Press Gallery, where I focus mostly on geopolitical issues, but in the past year or so have looked a lot at Chinese political influence in New Zealand and human rights issues.
And I know you've spent a lot of time telling your story, but tell us about how your interactions with Peace Data started. How were you approached?
It was completely out of the blue. So I got a message on LinkedIn from someone who called themselves Alice Schultz, who we now know wasn't probably anyone called Alice Schultz, but she just said, "Hey, I've seen that you're a freelance journalist. I had just recently set my my LinkedIn profile and all of my social media profiles to freelance because I was looking for work." And she just said, "Hey, we've got this new not-for-profit organization. We're a type of a news outlet. We're focusing on things like human rights abuses and social issues around the world, and we were wondering whether you'd be interested in writing for us." And it sounded like a really good cause and a good organisation, and so we started emailing backwards and forwards, and it all kind of went from there.
And LinkedIn was typically a place where you might have this kind of approach from someone, so that didn't strike you as being out of the ordinary.
I'm actually quite new to freelancing. So before this, I was based in New Zealand and had always worked as a permanent employee, as, you know, a staff reporter, I guess. So it seemed normal to me. Of course, I don't have heaps of experience, but it didn't seem abnormal that someone would approach me on LinkedIn soon after I had said, "Hey, I'm a freelancer and I'm looking for work." And everything seemed quite genuine, and it did seem to fit in with the subject areas that I had been covering quite a bit recently around human rights issues and different geopolitical issues, particularly in New Zealand.
And what were the terms of your agreement with Alice and Peace Data? How did you sort of settle on the topic, the payment, and all the back and forth?
So after LinkedIn, we took the conversation over to email, and she told me a little bit more about Peace Data, or I guess what they were telling people that Peace Data was.
Right.
And from there, she spelled out their mission a little bit more, and the types of topics that they were interested in. And I just put forward a few ideas, that things that I had covered in the past that were familiar to me. And I gave them about 4 different potential topic areas or story topics. And the one that she picked out from my list was Chinese political interference in New Zealand, which, of course, now I completely recognize the irony there.
Right.
And yeah, so we went for that one, and she just basically said, "We don't have heaps of money, but we could pay you $250 for a 1,000-word article if you're keen to do that." So I went away. I took a couple of weeks. I wrote the article. I filed it, and that was kind of the end of it as far as I was aware at that point.
You submitted your story. And when did you start to realize that something was off?
It was quite a shock, actually. It really came out of the blue. So I had no inkling that anything was off. Like you said, I just moved on to the next project. I wasn't following Peace Data too closely. I wasn't checking in to see what was being published on the website. And then one evening I saw I had a message from a Reuters journalist, and he said, "Hi, my name's Jack. I want to talk to you about the work that you did for Peace Data." And of course, the alarm bells went off, and I thought, oh no, what's going on here? So it was completely out of the blue for me. And I remember being on the phone with the journalist, and he was interviewing me about my experience. And I was simultaneously Googling the media stories and the Facebook press release and trying to kind of wrap my head around what I had been involved in.
And what was he telling you? What were you actually learning sort of in real time in this call?
Basically that I'd been used as part of a Russian influence operation, which is bizarre. Not something I would obviously have expected to happen to me. Not something I thought about or even considered when I started writing for Peace Data or doing freelance work. So it was unusual and unexpected and perplexing and also really intriguing. And I remember at points in the conversation, I was kind of laughing in disbelief and then telling him, I don't find this funny, don't make out as though I'm this is a joke or I'm laughing about it. But it was quite confusing, really. It's
kind of incredulous that this could even be a thing, it sounds like.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, I was aware that these types of operations exist. After the 2016 US presidential election, you couldn't not be aware. But I didn't really know how they worked or who they targeted, and of course, never expected to be part of this myself. So, it was all unexpected, I guess.
And I think a lot of our listeners have probably heard of influence operations. As you've said, this was a big part of the last US campaign, and it's really been growing over time. But, our listeners probably like you wouldn't necessarily know what to look for or might assume that it wouldn't happen to them. When you were interacting with, Alice, as you called her, on social and email, were you on the lookout for signs that this could be an influence operation? Or do you think you missed anything? Or how do you kind of look back on this?
So I definitely missed things. I wasn't looking for it. I wasn't expecting it. Like you said, I was aware that influence operations existed, but I didn't expect to be a target, and I wouldn't have thought there would be any reason for me to be a target. Obviously, now I know a lot more. There were lots of little inconsistencies, and in hindsight, obviously, with that 2020 vision, there are things that jump out, little things like only wanting to pay via PayPal, how keen they were on the Chinese interference angle of a story, the fact that I was contacted out of the blue. I had no other connection to them. Her social media profile was new, it wasn't populated. There were some funny little things like she kept referring to peacedata.com rather than peacedata.net as the URL. And at the time, I just wrote everything off as, they're a brand new not-for-profit. They're just starting out. They probably don't have a lot of experience or money or expertise. But, I just chalked it up to, maybe a bit of a cock-up rather than a conspiracy, and wrote it off as that. And, of course, in hindsight, I kind of see all of those red flags. But when you're not skeptical and you're not questioning that and you're not expecting it, you just don't see it.
I mean, I think a lot of people are like that, even in terms of the social media they consume. They might be generally aware of disinformation, but, have that sort of, well, it's not happening to me, or that's not, the sources that I'm looking at. So, frankly, not really surprising. Do you have any sense of why they might have targeted you?
I guess it could have just been that I was a freelance journalist. It's hard to know kind of the level of detail or sophistication in terms of picking out the targets. Like I said, I had worked on some kind of topics in this area already. I had been covering some human rights issues from a New Zealand perspective. Like I said, I just recently set my my social media profiles to be a freelancer looking for work. So maybe that, set up some flags for them. I'd also just moved country. So I had moved from New Zealand to London just as COVID hit. So, probably seen as a more vulnerable person and an easier target, someone looking for work in a COVID environment. But it is hard to know exactly, how many layers down they would have gone in that. I guess on the surface, I was a reporter who was willing to do freelance work and who potentially had a bit of a network of influence that I could share the articles with.
Yeah, and had an interest in these topics that, as you said, were, well within what you've been writing about. What have you taken away from this experience? And are there any messages that you want to share with other journalists or even just, listeners to this podcast about influence operations?
Yeah, so it's been an interesting experience for me all up. I mean, like I said at the start, I was a bit perplexed and confused, and it was also really intriguing, but it sparked my interest, and I wanted to learn more about this and why me, and how did I become a part of this? In doing that, I feel like I've learned quite a lot, and I feel like I would really like other journalists to learn a lot of the things that I've learned, just in terms of the who is targeted and the how they are targeted. Like we were saying earlier, people are generally aware of these operations and campaigns, but a lot of the time I think they exist in the abstract. So understanding that obviously, these are real people that are targeted. If it could happen to me, it could happen to you. And you don't want to catastrophize and you don't want people to get scared, but they should realize that they're out there, right? They're not going to stop. So it's up to you as a reporter or a writer or an influencer to make yourself less of a target. And I guess a lot of that, and people say this all the time, but I guess part of it's just educating yourself, right? Learning more about these influence operations, understanding that they do exist, that journalists do have influence and can, be quite an integral part of these operations. And once you know that, and you're aware and you're a little bit more discerning or skeptical, then you make yourself less of a target. And so I guess that's the message that I'd want to share with people. Be aware, learn a bit more about them, and try and make yourself a little bit less of a target.
Well, thanks so much for sharing your story with us, Laura. We really appreciate it, and I think that's a message that everyone needs to hear.
Thanks.
We'll be back in a minute to do a deep dive into influence operations with one of Carnegie's experts, Alicia Wanless. Alicia Wanless is the director of the Partnership for Countering Influence Operations at the Carnegie Endowment. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start with a broad overview of the peace data story that we just heard from Laura. What exactly was the goal of this operation?
It's generally pretty hard to say what the goal of any covert influence operation might be. To do that, we generally need to know who's behind it, what their aim was, and that can be a challenge. But generally speaking, a campaign that seeks to engage domestic actors to produce and spread content, there's definitely a goal to appear more organic and reach existing audiences through those established networks.
Is targeting journalists with disinformation a new phenomenon in this space?
No, using journalists to launder disinformation isn't new. Although in this case, the journalists weren't spreading disinformation. They weren't hired to deliberately spread misleading or false content, but to report on, quote, underreported issues. And they might have done that at any type of outlet. The act of disinfo here is really more one of misrepresentation, with peace data posing as an independent media outlet, not disclosing its Russian origins.
And do you think that the digital era then and oversaturation of information has really impacted this process?
I think it's changed operators' abilities to reach journalists in other countries. So, for example, if I were to give you a historic example of where this has happened in the past, if that's helpful, news media has always been a vector or a potential vector for spreading disinformation. In 1860 in Dallas, there was a series of fires. And the editor of the Dallas Herald at the time, whose press office was destroyed in the fires, took it upon himself to contact other editors of Southern papers, outlining a plot. And basically what he claimed was that the fires were all deliberate, set by abolitionists and slaves as part of an insurrectionary movement. And this conspiracy then spread throughout the Southern press with a bit of hysteria resulting in some violent protests and attacks against alleged conspirators. The only thing was the fires weren't started by anyone. They were just spontaneous combustion of things like matches in the extreme heat of Texas. But through other editors in that network of Southern newspapers, this plot kind of spread massively. Now, that was one editor able to reach a wider audience with his conspiracy theory through that network of editors. But in a digital age, this is much easier to achieve. So the Peace Data case shows that a Russian editor can engage American and New Zealand journalists in a matter of minutes via email, social media, or other web-based communications.
And you talked about the importance of being credible to local audiences. Is that why they target journalists in particular?
Yeah, very much. So journalists tend to have fairly decent followings on things like Twitter, but if they're also publishing content through bigger outlets, they have that audience through their official affiliation. So encouraging journalists to take up messages helps increase the audience fairly quickly. But additionally, some studies have shown that people are much more likely to believe someone they perceive to be similar to them or to have influence. And so by nature of their followings, journalists tend to be seen to have influence. But also when speaking to compatriots, they also come across as being more familiar than, say, a fake social media account might appear.
You're an expert at this. You eat, sleep, and breathe influence operations. When you look at the messages between Laura and Alice, what stands out to you? And to follow on, how can a non-expert understand messages like this and determine their authenticity?
So it's always a lot easier to say with hindsight of 2020 vision, what was obvious or not. And I feel quite badly for journalists in this regard, because how are you supposed to tell, what's coming in and if the inbound is actually legitimate? There are a few things that stood out to me in that email. The first thing was that Alice Schultz was using a Gmail account not affiliated with this new media outlet that supposedly had its own domain. Her focus on content also stood out to me, with the quote of concerning the least discussed but important themes suggests that she sought controversial issues. But moreover, in her opening, she literally states that they want to ask journalists in other countries to increase objectivity and authenticity. That stood out to me as something that was worrisome in retrospect, for sure. But in later exchanges, the fact that Alice is encouraging republication of pieces and that they were willing to pay for that, offering a bonus if they're successful. Yeah, when most places want copyrights for the things they're paying for, right? So that seemed off to me.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And so, again, if you're a lay person looking at something like this, it almost sounds like similar to a phishing email. Look to see if something about the Gmail is a little bit off or the language is a little bit off. But these were pretty sophisticated.
Yeah, it's really hard to say. I mean, this operation was sophisticated in the sense that, they had the site up and going and they were targeting people who clearly needed work. But some things that are obvious are like, does the email come from something that actually matches the domain and the institution? How long has that institution been around, right? Like, what does the about section say about them? Who are the people behind it? Do they have a good digital presence? One thing that I did find in digging into Peace Data was that there was a URL linking into it saying that they were partners with a really dodgy think tank, which was also hosted on a domain name that was registered in Russia.
So small tells if you do some digging, but still not enough to, sort of shout the intent to the world. How else do influence operations manifest? We've talked about this one particular case, but who are other common targets?
So influence operations really vary widely, depending on who's behind them and what their aim is. In a similar way to targeting journalists, politicians are also often used as a means for reaching a much broader audience quickly. In the context of elections, this tends to manifest in the hack and dump tactic that surfaces compromising or salacious information on a target, which few political opponents can resist the urge to jump on. So looking to the last election in 2016, the Podesta email dump is a good example, and how through WikiLeaks, Donald Trump and his supporters surfaced that content for their own ends.
And I guess we're only a few weeks away from the election here, so bracing ourselves for some kind of similar October surprise. As someone who's working in this space, tell us a little bit more about what you might be looking for in terms of the election. Are there any warning bells going off in your head as we speed toward November 3rd?
In general, I mean, when it comes to foreign influence operations, there's a small drop in the manipulated space that is our information environment. For me, the concerns have always been much more the domestic influence operations and how they might interact with foreign ones, like with that leak example. What troubles me the most in this election, though, is all the priming for a contested election and how interest-based networks have developed around things like militias, for example, who might be well coordinated to respond should the results not turn out as they wish. But what's most problematic is this lack of political will to want to do anything remotely serious about influence operations. And that shows in the emphasis on foreign over domestic activities. I mean, Elizabeth Warren seemed to be the only candidate who had been pledging not to engage in disinformation. But unfortunately, until we as a society come to grips with the role of influence in democracies and understand the full spectrum of actors and their aims in engaging in influence operations, including politicians, we don't really stand much of a chance to deal with the problem.
I've heard you say that much of the public-facing rhetoric around influence operations focuses on discussions of the problem. You just laid out for us a fairly depressing scenario in which policymakers don't do anything, but how would you advise them to go about trying to address the problems that are posed by disinformation campaigns? Maybe especially because in some cases, there are benefits in a way to the vast amounts of information that are flowing around.
Yeah, so I'm always really good for a dark view anytime you want that dark cloud, Laura. I think in general, we need to reframe the problem. We need to look at this more strategically. Right now, we're overly focused on individual aspects of influence operations like disinformation, and we aren't seeing the wider issue as a whole. So, for example, social media platforms tackle individual aspects of influence operations, like taking down fake accounts or removing instances of disinformation, and they're all done as separate issues. An alternative might be to look at the various component parts of influence operations together, aggregating statistics around all of those infractions to try to identify proactive indicators. So we know when an influence operation is happening in real time, so to speak. But to be strategic about something like influence operations also requires looking beyond the tactics to a broader conceptual framing. For example, much of the discourse around influence operations right now tries to piece out foreign originating campaigns as being some singular problem to be addressed. But as the peace data operation shows, those lines between foreign and domestic quickly blur in a hyper-connected, globalized world.
And the other challenge I would imagine is that, like so many things with the web and internet and online engagement, the question of who owns the issue, whether there's government action, whether there's action by industry in the private sector. You mentioned social media. What do you see as the role for corporate actors, specifically tech companies, and maybe in cooperation with government?
Yeah, so tech companies, they're one of the few points of intervention in addressing influence operations. Social media platforms obviously play a huge role in terms of facilitating influence ops, but also in potentially doing something about the problem. I think the bigger question here is how they decide to intervene, and do they have enough input from wider society to make those decisions? I mean, to be frank, on a topic like influence operations, there's so much pressure on companies to act, but very little by way of articulation on what we as a society deem unacceptable, much less translating that understanding into practical policy solutions that can be implemented at scale.
So where do you think we go from here? Presuming we have, a fairly peaceful outcome of the U.S. election, you're transported to be a policymaker sometime in early 2021. It's a thorny issue. You mentioned there's a lot of different kind of actors. Is there one particular step that you think would make an appreciable difference that any administration could take to tackle this in the United States?
I think it's a broad step. It's a high level step. I think that we need to pull back and see both sides of the influence ops coin. On one hand, everybody's doing influence to a degree, whether it's in public diplomacy or otherwise. But then we're also talking about countering it. And those two things are not separate. We have to kind of go back to a higher level and look at the total sum of options and threats related to influence that a state faces. And then from there, start to identify what tools are available, but also articulate what's going to be acceptable and what's going to be unacceptable. Where are our lines? And how can we define those as a society to then guide actors like industry to really put in measures that help us and protect them?
On that note, thank you so much for joining us, Alicia.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to The World Unpacked, produced by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We're grateful for your listen and eager for your feedback. We welcome your emails at podcasts@ceip.org. And please rate and review us on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can find me, Laura Lucas Magnuson, on Twitter @Laura L. Magnuson. These discussions are only made possible by our wonderful team behind the pod. Our audio engineer is Tim Martin, and our executive producer is Maya Krishna Rogers. We'll see you next time.